Again, my name is Sarah. I lead the team that works directly with our startup partners. And the goal of this session today is walk through the core things to know as you begin the work to embed your products into a health system. And the reason that I'm here today is because while the long sales cycle is something that is pretty common knowledge, discussion about the post-sale process hardly comes up, and specifically related to integration. And how you integrate with health systems it has a big impact on the overall success of your implementation. What we've found having partners that are equipped with this knowledge have smoother implementations and have fewer missed expectations between their teams and the health systems that they're selling to. So for a little bit of background on me, just so you get to know me a little bit, I've been in healthcare IT for around 10 years. I've been an implementer, I've been a product owner, I've been in demo, and then now in sales. And through that, over the years, I've sat in on a number of sales calls from both sides of the table, and there are a lot of lessons learned that I'm excited to share with you. And at Redux, this experience comes from working with all sizes of health systems and vendors that are looking to be able to scale out projects to all of these health systems as fast as possible. So here's the agenda for what I'm looking to cover today. Again, the goal is really discussing how to break past the sales cycle to getting live with an integration with your health system partners. And I'll cover these best practices we've identified for selling to health systems, to a high-level view into the standards that exist in the market, and then some of the technical challenges you'll face as you tackle integration. So you've seen this slide before. Nico already showed this today, so I'll cover it briefly, but I wanted to show it again to really just articulate what the healthcare landscape looks like today. We know that digital progress is an imperative for the modern healthcare CIO and their teams. They're faced with a number of challenges: decreased profit margins, as Nico mentioned, increased competition, and really the industry is ready for disruption, and health systems are also hungry to take on that new technology. A recent study by the AMA found that 75% of health systems do believe that this innovation is necessary to meeting their long-term goals. But while there's that need, 70% of leaders do not believe that their IT department have the resources to really effectively support the level of innovation they're looking to take on. And on average, it takes 23 months, so almost 2 years, from identifying a digital solution to implementing and scaling that solution. And that's a long time, really, in anybody's world, but in particular, if you are a startup and you're looking to gain traction fast. So the other thing that I'll add that I think is really at the crux of the problem is this 54% number. That number of leaders believe that the time put into digital innovation is spent inefficiently. And health systems need to have access to new technology, but they do it at massive cost. And what we call that at Redux is the innovation adoption gap. It's a problem that we hope to help you solve, and we believe that part of the goal of this talk today is to help you get to some solutions to help solve that problem. So digging into some of those numbers, I wanted to isolate integration as part of that problem and talk about integration as a really critical part of your overall product implementation. Integration today, as it stands, is just not optimized in the healthcare space. We experience a lack of consistent standards, heavy work effort for health systems to perform these integrations, and the overall backlog of projects that IT teams have is really a problem for them. It's really important to be able to differentiate yourself as a vendor by not adding to these difficulties through having a weak integration strategy. So really, in short, you can help solve for these stats by approaching your project and implementation with a very solid recommendation and approach. So as you can see with the numbers, 67% of healthcare orgs have missed business opportunities as a result of a poor integration, and 59% characterize integration as the Achilles heel for their organization. And that's a pretty serious thing to say. So what this gap creates is it's a conflict between your stakeholders and the IT teams that have to take on the burden and work to implement your technology. And I mentioned before, most health systems have these backlogs of projects. So a big thing that is important as a technology vendor is learning how to speak to the technical folks to assure them, I'm not going to be a part of that problem, and I can help you by having a faster implementation than you're typically going to experience. And where I really believe you can start to differentiate yourself is even at the beginning of the sales cycle. So as a vendor, you can set yourself apart by showing a prescriptive approach to your product's implementation, the technical requirements that you have, and being able to really clearly articulate that to your champion and across the board as you're having conversations with your health system partners. It also means as you're working with those health systems, you need to start asking questions to understand their level of readiness so that you can best plan out for rolling out your projects. All right, so let's begin. I wanted to, take almost a list-like approach to talking through the recommendations I have, because I think this is a helpful way to start thinking about creating a frictionless experience for your customers. So the first step in doing this is really training your sales team to be able to talk the talk technically. And at Redux, because we're an integration platform, our technical work, when we're working with vendors, it starts once our partners are ready to kick off new projects. And when I'm working with new partners, the way that we evaluate readiness is by two tracks specifically. We follow a technical track and an operational track. From a technical standpoint, but before ever engaging in a conversation with a health system, we talk through workflow feasibility and the scope of the integration. And this is something that we do well ahead of time to make sure that what the application wants to do is technically possible within the construct of healthcare, and also that the integration capabilities of the EHR can support it as well. And in having that conversation, I really want to make sure that our partners have a clear picture of what's possible so that when we meet with their customers, we're not on the same page. We want to make sure that we are giving that same crystal clear definition and depiction of their scope. It also is just a part of being prescriptive and making sure that the health system knows that you understand who they are, the systems that they use, and that we can hit the ground running and be successful. So the second track that we work through is understanding what stage of operational readiness the health system is at. And what this really means is at what stage of the sale is our customer in, the vendor in, and to what extent is the health system really ready to kick off a project and have the resources that they need to have at the table when we're ready to start. So questions related to that operational readiness would be, does the application have a contract signed? Do you have a BAA with your health system partner? Have you gone through security? And have you put in a project request form to make sure that you have those resources assigned? When I ask these questions to our partners, it really helps me know realistically when the project can kick off. And it helps make sure that we tee up the right folks on our end to be successful. And I mentioned all of those because I think those tracks are very helpful for your sales and technical folks as well. And they're areas that your team should be able to navigate to make sure that you're tackling questions about scope early. And so that you, as you're looking to identify timing and queue up projects on your own side, you have the right folks ready and the resources ready from your teams. Another trait from a sales perspective that's really important is your sales folks being able to sell to a group versus simply selling to an individual. There are a number of roles that are going to be represented within your customer's ecosystem, and it's important to learn how to speak to each one of those roles versus simply focusing on the business side. So, the way that I kind of think about this is when you're looking to sell your product, you're absolutely developing a relationship and defining the value of your product to your champion, but you're going to need to impress everyone who's a part of that conversation. So the first, inroads in working with health systems and selling to health systems is having a champion who is able to help guide you through the process and help you articulate the ROI of your product to the other folks that are going to be a part of the conversation. So here's an example of what a healthcare organization org chart looks like. Healthcare organizations are really complex, and you'll want to make sure that you have multiple points of contact within the org. This is for a lot of reasons, but really to make sure that when you're having conversations about the value that your product gives to the organization, you have diversity in the perspectives and folks that you're having conversations with. And as you can see, there are many different titles and roles that have influence within a healthcare organization, but there are also a lot of shared responsibilities and interaction between those roles. So given all those contacts, it's really important to drill into who specifically you'll be interacting with during the sale of the health system. And on this slide, we've got a few key stakeholders that you'll need to speak with before being ready to tackle the IT conversation just generally. So from left to right, the four main themes we'll cover are your champions, governance, legal and security, and then IT. So for those champions, your first stakeholders are going to be these folks. They're your clinical and operational champs. They care about the value you're offering to their user base and will be the core partners that you have in vying for IT and health system organizational support. They're going to be the ones that will help you navigate the waters, learn how their organization is different, and avoid any pitfalls that might be common at their institutions. So the kinds of questions that they're going to be interested in are, what's the workflow going to look like? Walk me through a demo of your product. How does the data flow into my workflow? And am I going to have to worry about double documentation? From the second tier, operations and governance, these folks are going to be asking for ROI statements and project plans. So things like social proving, information on how the implementation will work. How is that going to look? What is your testing methodology? Can you help me make and understand the business case for your product? They also generally want to know a little bit more about the competitive landscape to see how you're different. And this stakeholder in particular cares about having a scalable process and easy way to pilot your application, or ideally a way to have a beta scope so that they can have a place to start and then grow the relationship with you from there. So for governance, you're going to have to follow their standard processes for project assignment, which really includes having a very tight project plan and information on what the implementation is going to look like. So a few kinds of questions that they might ask are, what integrations do you offer? How long will it take to stand up an integration? What's your support model? And do you have a project plan and integrated testing workflows or scripts that we can use to make sure that we're successful? From a security and legal standpoint, they're going to want to make sure you can confirm your application is secure. Having certifications like your HITRUST or SOC 2 are a common, very positive response to this question. You also need to have a business associates agreement with your partners in order to transact data with their EHR. So the kinds of questions these folks ask are, how do you securely integrate your product? What are your requirements related to consuming PHI? What are your safeguards against breaches? What does your authentication process look like? Do you use SSO? And how do you provision users and accounts? So then finally, we get to the technical stakeholders. And once you're talking with IT folks, you really don't want to be at a point where you're in a discovery space with your health system partners. And what I mean by that is we sometimes see applications might ask a question like, well, how would you like to see this look? Or where would you like to see this integrated? And it's great to be flexible, but this isn't really the place to offer up that flexibility because it really translates to uncertainty in scope. And so this is really getting back to that technical track I was mentioning before. So what you'll need to be able to tell this person is specifically what data you need from the EHR or other system ancillary systems, what standards you support, and how the application interacts with overall clinical or end user workflow. So this is where you're going to get more technical questions surrounding your integration strategy and long-term roadmap as well. Another thing I'll mention here is this is also where, depending on how fully developed your application is, and this is something that has a different level of importance across the board, depending on if you're a newer stage company or if you've been around for a while, we very much so recommend that your integration capabilities be fully ready and tested before any project kicks off. From a Redux perspective, what that means is sending test messages through the engine. The primary reason for this is, it takes a varying amount of time for IT to be ready for a project. And when they are ready, it's really important to not slow them down. And being ready on your end from a technical perspective is really critical here. So that was a lot of content, so I wanted to take a little bit of a pause. This slide has some helpful advice and gives a little context for the relationships within health systems. Healthcare does have process, but it's because of really the critical nature of the work that's being done and the sensitivity of the data involved. So that process is something that will always exist, but the roles that you interact with and understanding the different steps that you'll experience are something that you should be ready to answer, and should be will be a standard part of the work that you have and that you will do with health systems. So then, once you've had the conversations that you need to with your stakeholders and the other folks that need to be bought into the vision of this project starting, in order to get past that stage, you'll have to, and to get your project implemented, you'll need to have a project that's slated. And along with that really comes, and how you get there is submitting a project request. So it's really important, and something that I think is valuable to begin early is having conversations with your champions about what this looks like. So is there a form that I fill out? How do I go about requesting a project at your institution? What this will help with, if you're able to start it early, is you will be able to save some time. And if you do make this request early, you will potentially not be blocked closer to the actual date that you're hoping to kick off. So again, just directly asking your champion about this and to put in a project request is something that if you can get that done before contracting is done, that's a really huge win for any partnership. So this screenshot is another example of a project request. It's pretty easy to get bogged down in the details of the graph. But the most important piece that I wanted to articulate is that every health system has a process, but every process looks a little bit different in how projects are prioritized and assigned. But you'll always have to ask to get resources assigned. So I wanted to give a real life example of how health systems prioritize applications and these requests. So to do that, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper with one of our partners, Brigham and Women. So a little bit of context about Brigham and Women and their iHub. The Brigham is an around 800-bed teaching hospital in Boston. And as a goal, this team wanted to pilot around 10 to 20 applications a year across the organization. In creating an innovation team, they identified that if they wanted to meet these lofty goals, they're going to have to make sure to really accelerate the way they think about application sourcing and implementation. So their goal is to implement technology faster and have the ability to scale out rapid integrated pilots. And the way that their sourcing works is the first components of that application vetting happens outside of IT and with key champions and subject matter experts. So similar to what we've been talking about today. They use the innovation team to evaluate which technology they want to implement. And then their sourcing is streamlined so that the value of the application is prioritized alongside the understanding of the overall complexity of taking on the project. And they're aware of what kinds of projects for them they would consider straightforward versus complex. And that's a really big part of how they decide, okay, is this a go or a no-go? And our partnership with the Brigham begins upstream as well, when a particular need has been identified by their stakeholders. So for the Brigham, they partner with us to help integrate their cloud-based applications, and working with an integration platform helps streamline some of their existing processes. And you can see from the bullets how they think about adopting and vetting new technology to eventually be prioritized from an IT standpoint. So after your champions are sold on the value of your product, we talked about being prescriptive with IT. How does that actually look, and how do you offer an implementation approach that is set with scale in mind? So to do this, you really need to start by knowing your scope, and I highly recommend keeping it simple. I break down integration scoping into 3 main areas. So what's the data that you're looking to consume from the EHR? What are you looking to file back? And what are the triggers that drive that exchange? So to start, how do you enroll patients in your application, and what kind of data are your users going to be interacting with from the EHR and then filing back to? So after you've identified your data requirements, you're going to need to identify the associated APIs or interfaces that are necessary. I'd highly recommend focusing on a scope that is streamlined and does not require for there to be any build or work done within the EHR to make that workflow possible. And I wanted to include this screenshot because I think the data is neat. It's a slide that shows you the breakdown of the kinds of data that is transmitted across nearly our 800 live sites using Redox. As you can see, that big green slice is about 58% of our integrations use ADT data specifically, or patient administration data. So the reason why I wanted to include it is, it's very important to recognize the things that are broadly available and valuable, and the other data models or data types that might be less common and also less necessary. So another fun slide. I wanted to keep talking about some of the risks of not having a well-defined scope. Once you've defined the scope that is critical for you, we absolutely recommend having a project plan that outlines this. I mentioned critical minimum as far as the data that you send. Having an MVP is really as an initial way for your health systems to see the value of your product is really important. And if needed, as you're looking at trying to work through how you will grow your relationship with these health systems, you can also outline the additional items that can be added to scope if, say, IT is able to approve it. So that way, you're able to offer a view into what you need from IT, but if they have extra space, they can take on more. And it also shows them the path to gaining more value from you in the future if they choose to phase in additional data elements and features. So in general, it's easier to get in the door with a smaller integration before expanding to a broader scope. Some health systems do want to take the approach that, if we're going to do an integration project, let's do it all. But in general, they don't mean like, hey, let's take on a project with 7 interfaces. 2 to 3 to start is more than enough. All right, so I mentioned having an MVP, and I really want to make sure that this information is specific and helpful. So I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. And what I mean by this is minimum viable product, of course. And from what we've learned, the more you can streamline the data needs that you have, the better. And we always want to scope up integrations with 2 goals in mind. And so the first is defining the minimum and the max for your scope. So this is really isolating what's mission critical for your technology to function. And maybe that's just that ADT data or patient demographics. If that's the case, that's awesome. And then from there, you can start identifying the nice to haves. And then the second is, what is your global integration strategy? As you expand to customers across different EHRs, their capabilities range quite a bit. And it's very important not to limit yourself to certain EHRs or certain parts of the market by requiring kind of the bells and whistles. And that MVP will give you a great starting point when you're looking to, say, a small doc practice that might have an EHR with fewer integration capabilities, but will give you the space to build from once you get to the more sophisticated ones. So as a concrete example, single sign-on is something that is not all that complicated to implement for some EHRs, but it's not available in many. So if it's something that's a part of your scope, it's good to evaluate, is this something that's critical for me, or is this simply a nice to have? A common mistake that we see from partners is counting on receiving non-standard data elements from the EHR. And the way that the conversation usually goes is, hey, we know that we can get this from a flat file, or we've seen this be documented in the EHR, so we do want this to be a part of our scope, or it's critical for our scope. And it really is a bummer to have to give the bad news that not all data elements are communicable outside of the EHR. And it's possible to ask for custom extracts or reports to get to data that might not be available through an API or an interface. But it's something that it's tricky to ask that from a health system. And also it adds an additional amount of work for them, which makes that option a potential barrier to your success and scale. And I think, another way to put that is within the healthcare space and within EHRs, overall, they are the result of use cases that are formed into products. And because of that, their systems and their data flows are, again, corresponding to those workflows. And so when you're thinking about scoping and when you're in that first conversation of understanding your customer's workflows, describing the intended steps will help more effectively identify the flow of data that's going to be necessary to drive your workflow. And then from there, uncover what may or may not be realistic from an integration standpoint. Really, as far as how you can understand if a data element is available or not is by doing your homework ahead of time. So either by digging into interface specs, asking customers what they're capable of, or even checking out some of our resources. So within our data models, we actually have information on the likelihood of elements being available within EHR's feed. And I really highly recommend looking there as a starting point to assess your integration workflow's feasibility. So finally, with that scope defined, there are a lot of tools you're going to want to have in your tool belt to secure confidence with your health system partners and to kick off effectively. So you'll need to have an overall project plan. So this should include the time, effort, and work estimates, information about what level of training is required, impacts on care areas. So will this affect inpatient? Will there be a rev cycle impact? You'll want to have an integrated testing plan that is a part of this project plan, which can include testing scripts and scenarios, as well as training materials if needed for your product. And you'll also want to ask and account for things that are on the operational side of the health system. So things like change control, so requests to make changes to production, upgrades of their EHR, and other potential IT freezes or things that could slow your time frame down. So those are things you'll just want to be asking about before projects start, and before identifying a go live date in particular, so that isn't your timeline that freezes, and instead you're going to have to account and extend if one of those things is happening during your project. And at the heart of it, it's really the more confident that you can be with this plan, and the more questions that you ask about their processes, the more confident that they will be, and it will help you gain credibility with the folks that are going to be kind of boots on the ground doing the implementation work. Okay, so now that we've talked about a lot of the process flow for getting started with health system partners, I wanted to take a little bit of a detour, and I've kept it pretty high level so far. This will also be high level. My colleague Brendan is going to be spending a lot of time digging into standards later on today. But I think it's worth it to take a quick dive just so you know what to expect. So the first thing I'll say is the EHR landscape is pretty wild and varied. It's part of what makes this a complex problem to solve. I've got a number of the major players that are out here on this slide, but just to kind of articulate some of the differences, you've got your on-premise EHRs, your cloud-based. As far as what that looks like operationally and how that will impact you requesting resources, some health systems are going to have IT that's owned in-house, and some will have IT that's outsourced to the vendor. EHR marketplaces are also becoming more commonplace as well as another option that you'll see as you look into getting started with integrating, and they offer a way to integrate at an EHR specific level versus being a little bit more agnostic in approach. As far as the main goal I had with this slide, every EHR is a little bit different in how they store and structure data, and every deployment of an on-premise EHR at least looks a little different from one another. So just like an Epic site won't resemble a Cerner site in how they're configured and look, an Epic site won't necessarily resemble another Epic site as well, given the level of customization that can take place over the course of an EHR implementation. So the second reason why integration is challenging is the number of standards and methods that exist for data exchange. I've talked about APIs and interfaces a number of times, but I just wanted to expand on that very briefly here. I think the most important thing outside of the details of the differences between these standards is it's just critical to know early on that you're going to have to accommodate for learning these skills or working with a partner that already has that knowledge. So one thing that I think is really important just from the overall process and project planning standpoint is, as you are in the phase of defining your project with IT, your health system analysts are going to need to know, which interfaces you'll need to have access to, or which APIs, what amount of filtering will need to be done just to make sure that you're getting the right data at the right time. What's your connectivity methods? Are you using VPN, versus secure HTTP, for example? And then how will you use the standards that they support, or do you support the standards that their EHR is capable of? This will also be, as you're working through scoping, there may be limitations from EHR to EHR that you have to accommodate for. For example, receiving flat files may be an option that you have to take if there isn't an interface for the data type that you care about. And we do have a number of resources to help with this, if this is kind of at the stage of the game that you're in. So this slide really just articulates some of the specific standards that are in use by the EHRs you'll commonly see. You see a mix of HL7 as well as API offerings throughout. In healthcare, the status quo of data exchange is based off of these point-to-point custom integrations that must be built every time a technology vendor wants to integrate with their product. With every EHR and every health system's deployment looking a little bit different, what that causes here is this slide, which I know that you've seen, but an unlimited almost amount of custom work that will need to take place as you're looking to implement, from one site to the next. I think the big impact here from an overall industry standpoint is there is a barrier that creates, barrier to adoption, barrier to scale, and has a high cost that impacts us as well. So when you're looking to show your knowledge in this area, these are the kinds of questions that you'll want to ask and that you'll want to make sure you're able to speak to. This set of questions, from my perspective, is what I usually use to start learning more about a new HR. And I think for the first, health systems can either have that in-house IT that I mentioned that handles their technical work, build, interfacing, and the other option is they might submit tickets to their vendor to request support. For the second, it's understanding which standard you need to support to work with the EHR. And for the third, it's important to know what your health system has licensed already when it comes to interfaces. So what capabilities do they have, and do they have what you need, or are they going to have to go through a process to get that licensed? So given the standards that exist out there, the need to have a clearly articulated path is important, and you'll eventually come to a place where you have to identify a plan and vendor for your integrations and solving for the various standards that are out there. And there are three broad types of integration solutions that you'll encounter. So I wanted to call them out here. The first is doing it yourself within an integration engine. You can license an engine, staff a team of people who will take on these integration projects. The second, there are consulting folks that do a similar work. And then the third are integration platforms. So working with a partner like us. While there are other platforms out there, there aren't any that we're aware of that are really approaching the problem the same way that we are, where you can create a single connection through our API, and through that single connection, approach any health system and integrate with any health system. And what we would argue is that this is really the most scalable and efficient way to integrate, as you not only do not have to take on the learnings of those standards and methods, but we can also help partner with you along the way to make sure that your strategy is solid as well. So that really brings me to what Redux does and where we can help. And I know the folks on the line have heard a lot about what we do, so I'm not going to dig into our value props per se. But as you know, we are a full service cloud-based engine. We're focused on bidirectional data exchange. But outside of the mechanics of the engine and how we work there, we also are really focused in making sure that you know how this problem is solved from your health system partner's perspective as well. So when we start working with a new partner, what we make sure that we do is have all of these items wrapped in a bow. So conversation about what this integration will look like for the health system, how we save them time, isolating those MVPs and making sure that when you're looking at translating your requirements across EHRs, that information is clear. And as part of the managed services that we offer, we also have a full team that helps make sure that your folks are aware of some of the gotchas when you're approaching a new health system or new EHR. And that includes really that global scoping and support to make sure as you're working with health systems and you're working with new partners, you know what some of those nuances are before you get to that point. We've absolutely, and I can speak for myself here, we've hit a lot of bumps along the way as we've integrated across all of the partners that we have. And what we really want to make sure is that you don't hit them as well. And we want to help you, conquer any integration project that you may take on. So to wrap us up, I wanted to end on these 3 notes. If nothing else, I'd love for you to take away these items from the session. First, having technical salespeople and people that are able to speak to a broad group is really valuable. Defining your scope before you get into these conversations, your MVP and approach are critical to being prepared and successful. And then EHRs and standards do vary immensely, so prepare accordingly. So I wanted to thank you for joining me today. I'm happy to take any questions, either here on the line, or if you'd like to reach out to me directly, my information is included on this slide as well.